became one tool amongst many to maintain and extend the family landholdings. International migration, as soldiers and policemen, for example, was one of the examples of a social resource that landholding classes were able to extract due to their privileged position within the British colonial system. In Kerala, colonialism and the plantation economy also introduced the idea of migration as a virtuous form of social mobility and modernity. International migration from Kerala became more pronounced in the post-1950s period, with subsequent rounds of economic transformation linked to petroleum extraction in the Middle East. And the same thing can be said for Punjab, of course, in post-independence phase in terms of European and Western countries bringing in more labour. Now, according to the National Sample Survey Office Survey of Migration in India 2007-8, the states, these are the states and not union territories, but the states with the highest share of total out-migrants residing in another country were Goa, Kerala and Punjab at 303, 204 and 164 out-migrants per 1,000 migrants. So that's how the NSS survey examines it. And I'll look at those details in a little bit more detail in a moment. But there is a problem in the design of both the NSS surveys and the National Family Health Studies surveys that have previously looked at migration, because they interview households to ask them about members overseas. And this is a problem in the case of Punjab because often entire families move overseas. So this methodological design is clearly a problem when we consider the nature of out-migration. So Indian Punjab, we see a much greater emphasis placed on securing permanent family migration, whereas in Kerala the experience of temporary circular labour migration dominates the region. And we can see that through various studies, but certainly the orientation to the Gulf, it's a geographical dimension as well, but it is much more pronounced in Kerala, which is common knowledge. In both Kerala and Punjab, the source of migrants is heavily concentrated, with 14% of with 14% of immigrants coming from Malappuram in North Kerala, and in Punjab is the region, the Doaba region, but especially surveys have shown that 52% of migrants come from the district of Jalandhar, followed by Hoshiarpur. Now, this spatiality is important to explore when it comes to understanding patterns of remittance linked development. For example, Indian migration generally reflects a clear urban bias. So the NSS survey showed that 7.2% of all rural male out-migrants were in another country, but it goes up to 15.9% for male urban out-migrants. And this is about the same for females, about double the figure. Now, Kerala and Punjab, so the interesting thing about Kerala and Punjab is that when we look at that information, what we show is that a significant number of migrants, out-migrants from these two states, come from the rural. So does this mean then that remittances and associated migration development impetus may disproportionately be directed to the rural in those two states? And a hypothetical but nonetheless interesting question to ask is whether direct rural to international out-migration might create some kind of fractured development, producing disjunctures that intensify certain types of social hierarchy. So I explain this hypothetical framework drawing on various processes evident across Kerala and Punjab today. So this is in some ways a hypothetical question looking at secondary data to see if we can find this information. And so I'll just here have a chart from that NSS survey to indicate rural male out-migrants. So these are people living in another country. You can see for both Kerala and Punjab they have a quite significant number of rural out-migrants. And I'm not looking at the union territories because they're an interesting collection, but I'm focusing just on states here. So let's explore this issue then. Now, certainly remittances can concentrate wealth in both urban and rural areas in India. For example, households in the top consumption quintile access half of all domestic remittance flows. And this is from a paper by Tumbe based on the NSS survey. In some cases, remittances can lead to interfamily jealousy. They can lead to a kind of toxic, capital-rich underdevelopment. And so the work of Ballard, in this case looking in parts of Pakistan, has illustrated this. Osella and Seller have also considered the contradictory outcome of migration as a process of modernity in Kerala. So the idea of migration leading automatically to some kind of, say, gender development is not necessarily the case. There's also the issue of how migration benefits do not necessarily disperse beyond the closure of social networks. As Kuran, in the study of 3 religious groups in Kerala and their migration, has argued, she maintains that different ethnic and religious communities utilise networks as a form of boundary maintenance to perpetuate their own migration routes and their own access to them. In the case of Punjab as well, Anjali Roy has recently examined the formation of what she calls a transnational Sikh narrative and argues, and I quote here, globalization is disrupted by increasing fragmentation through the global return of ethnicity and religion in the present that affirm primordial ties, end quote. So here she's actually lending some credence to Huntington's thesis. And she's arguing that the kind of global idea of Sikhism is perpetuating certain kinds of divisions. Another point that counters migration as a development panacea is that states that receive the most remittances in India also demonstrate the most internal consumption inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. So the question is this evidence of international migration boosting inequality? I mean, that's not what we ideally want. Or is it, as Swaminathan argues in a recent piece in the Economic Times, merely evidence of greater returns to migration? So should we read greater inequality in consumption as indicators of early positive development in the right direction? I mean, this is an important question that individuals will come at from different kind of ideological positions. And if we continue thinking about this idea of fractured development, both states, both Kerala and Punjab, their economies face challenges that are in part compounded by migration-related issues. In Punjab, for example, the agrarian crisis is a major challenge to the state in its development efforts. And though the diaspora has had a positive impact on the Green Revolution and on Punjab's development, it cannot help but be piecemeal in a wider context of state deficiency in social and physical infrastructure development. In Kerala, commentators have also identified that recent economic growth that's been witnessed in the state can be accounted for by successful tertiary sector development. But this is dogged by issues of unemployment and the problem of ineffective conversion of the skills of return migrants into the domestic economy. And this is an ongoing concern. Migration and remittance income can also create a class of young people who resist lower status labour in order to pursue the possibility of higher status options overseas. And this occurs even if educational qualification compression and unproductive, as the term in Kerala is, time passing, is engaged in. So if there's always the lure of getting that contract in Dubai, why engage with something you don't really need to in Kerala? In terms of remittances, even when spent in ostensibly productive ways, there's the problem of overconsumption. In Punjab, the over-mechanisation of agriculture has been seen as the consequence of inflows of capital, and also the desire to use tractors as a form of status. In Kerala, the high rate of remittances the state receives has perplexed some commentators who wonder, where does the money go? In some cases, it's invested in gold, as across all of India, and India is a country that arguably absorbs about a quarter of the gold mined globally. Now, certainly this is a good position to be in, considering the current price of gold, but how far is gold a productive investment? How will its value be translated to economic development? Or is it merely the currency that recirculates in the form of new migrants funded by family gold? So when that young man gets that opportunity for that 3-year contract in Dubai, the family pulls the gold and sells the gold to give them the money to do this. So we have to think about whether this is a really productive investment for India, or merely reproducing global migration circuits. Migration opportunities can also be seen as reflected in the rise of private education and the increasing role of migrant intermediaries. The downside of this is highlighted, for example, in Oshi's work, where she looks at female migrants, not just from India but generally, where she argues there exists a trapping mechanism which includes some aspects of migration such as high placement fees, financial mismanagement by spouses, consumerism and disrupted family relations. And this financially condemns migrants to years of circular migration. Consumption is another variable in the migration process. So in Kerala, for example, Sarad Moni and Kuran highlight the negative role consumption demands play in Kerala. And this is driven by and drives the demand for overseas migration. In both states, social and economic change linked to overseas migration can be seen as a double-edged sword, with processes of wealth transfer entrenching pre-existing hierarchies in many cases and potentially contributing to such things as, if we look at some specifically gendered examples, the abandoned NRI bride syndrome, very evident in Punjab, and the ills of modern dowry inflation. And we could maybe push this even further and begin to consider how it may impact the worrying dispersal of sex selection, as the last census showed us, away from the north to other parts of India. In Punjab, the changing nature of rural life linked to migration and shifting social caste relations creates a heady mix of hierarchy and exogenous wealth. In the complex intersection of the global and the local, migration becomes one more feature that adds to the socio-political shifts underway in rural India, as Jodhpur has outlined in the case of Punjab. And in Kerala, Kuran's research on migration has found that, and I quote here from her work, the rapid enrichment made possible by international migration results in a reinterpretation and redefinition of religion, identity and practice. Caste divisions were eroded in the Muslim localities, redefined in the Hindu areas, and strengthened in the Christian regions. So thus migration becomes another plank in the evolving and complex transitions occurring in India. And Punjab and Kerala are two locations that demonstrate how the opportunities of international migration and the wealth generated from it can contribute to the intensification of caste, class, regional, religious differences, and thus further undermine collective efforts to deal with the uncertainties of market conditions under capitalist expansion. So in conclusion, what I've tried to show here is the value of a geographic lens, despite the inevitable lack of depth such a process allows for. Exploring the contrasts and similarities between Punjab and Kerala in terms of migration and development is one way to examine how the terms migration and development co-construct each other. And again, as Raghuram asks us, quote, how migration unsettles certain scalar politics and temporal frames while buttressing others, end quote. So the point is, what looks good in abstract may turn unpleasant up close. Remittances have social and not just economic value, and it's difficult to know how migration policy can address any negatives associated with these grounded social processes. While Cadrea argues, for example, looking at policy issues, argues for an adversary index to identify what he terms the most painful and gainful aspects of migration in order to direct bilateral negotiations, such agreements do not necessarily address the nature of migrant returns on the ground. How are structures of traditional social exclusion articulated with migration? How can migration policy broaden opportunities beyond networks of closure? Also, the demonstration effect in migrant rural settings has particular meanings for youth and particular consequences for agrarian development. So I haven't even really begun to talk about the intersections of different circuits of migration in this particular context. I mean, as Marx has argued, youth is the alchemy of revolution, And is migration in some ways a form of co-option? Is it a pressure valve that offers an alternative, but are the returns diminishing value over time? I mean, these are all very complex questions to try and get a handle on. Gendered outcomes are also variable. Social shifts may occur in light of policy change. So, for example, education and shifts in policy to more higher skilled. Migration is one part of the larger imperative of creating more socially inclusive development in India. So just to close then, arguably the very idea of migration as contributing to positive development outcomes has become so widely supported by various groups that debate may develop myopia when it comes to critical assessment. The collective migration circuits groups become embedded with, and the enduring impact the migration process has over the long term, for those who go and stay, needs to be more thoroughly assessed before we can declare that international migration is overly positive in terms of the development of the out-migration region. In the case of India, the important question may not be, does migration lead to development? Because invariably it does, as we heard this morning from the Secretary of Moya. The more difficult question to ask is exactly what kind of development, where, and to whose benefit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Walton-Robert. In fact, we have had extremely provocative papers, and in fact, as I was listening to Dr. Walton-Roberts, I was looking at Dr. Thandi, Professor Thandi here, that he would say something on Punjab and so on. But of course, the limits of a session are there, the time limits. And we have about 10 minutes for discussion before I hand it over to the rapporteur discussant, Mr. Dr. Muhammad Salahuddin. Well, questions may be brief and to the point and may be directed to the presenters concerned. Yes, Dr. Paramjit. Is there a mic to be taken?
Well, first of all, my compliments to all of them. I think each one has given a different perspective and of different regions, and it has been a good learning exercise. Coming to diaspora development, we have done a study in Punjab, and we have not looked at all the aspects, but looked at the aspects, in particular those areas where the government is involved. The Punjab government has a scheme, they try to encourage diaspora to participate, and they give some percentage, 25%, 50%. But I think we have found, that in those cases, it is very minimal. It is over-projected, that diaspora is really involved, in the development or overtaking that. And I think we found that in 1 year alone, which is the highest last year, it is about 9 crores, which is even less than the 1 yearly contribution, which our members of parliament get from the government for development and things like that. I think we have to see that in total perspective, things like that. And secondly, I think my question is for Bridge Marathe. I think I met you a long time ago in Malaysia when I was there, when you came for the conference. I wonder how is South Africa's experience in the concept of brain gain or drain?
Please. Yes.
No, I'll be quick. It's a good question. In the South African context, there has been a loss. There's been a brain drain, and it was largely the white, skilled professionals who left the country because of a fear of what democracy may bring, and also, I think, trying to compensate for the loss of privileges that was associated with the apartheid era. But as we move down, 17 years down the road, South Africa is a very stable democracy, several democratic elections, etc. There is a sense of reality coming in. A lot of gain went to New Zealand and Australia. I'm told now that young white couples with growing kids are actually returning to South Africa. It's not been started. I want to put a student onto this project because of concerns about the decline of public education in Australia. So some of our so-called former, we call it Model C schools. These are partly subsidized by parents. Offer world-class education, So while there's been movement to and fro, people are returning, but we've got a problem. We have a problem of xenophobia, where there's a dislike of foreign migrants from Africa. And that's a very serious and almost an embarrassing problem because we were supposed to be a democratic society open to all parts of the world, but I can talk about that later.
Thank you. Yes, Kiran.
Professor Maharaj, and
can you have the mic, please?
hello. My question is to Professor Maharaj, and it's to do with the brain drain. And I'm glad that Professor Walton-Robert has mentioned this. I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate in suggesting that economists have, with their models and calculations, have come up with the possibility that if you look at it in the long run, it is possibly a gain rather than a drain. And there have been positive re-examination of the whole concept of brain drain. But apart from that, if you look at it from the point of view of the actors, the big families and so on, then it gets much more nuanced than people going away, because for the families it's actually beneficial. But it also depends on whether the state is spending the money. If it's the families who are spending money for education, then it's actually an investment. The way they look at it is an investment. So that's all I have to say.
I'll be brief. I think that's a good point. I've deliberately taken a very macro approach, and I certainly, if you look at the microdynamics, then certainly families do benefit. I think that's without a shadow of doubt. But since we're focusing on development overall, and I think that was my intention, in the majority of South African universities, they are heavily subsidized by the public sector. So when I look at the investment that's made, etc., it's made for the public sector, it's taxpayer money, and that is why when people move, it is a loss. And this is the harsh reality of Africa, that we've lost skilled professionals. And while I have a second here, I'd like to add, I referred to the example of Ethiopia. A more immediate example is Zimbabwe. Between 2000 and 2008, I think, and I'm guessing here, but I think it's an educated guess, they've lost 80% of professionals completely. So yeah, we can continue this discussion.
I think there is time for one more question before I hand it over to Mohammed Salahuddin. Who is there? At the back? Yes, please. Somebody at the back? Yes?
Yeah, my question is to Dr. Metka, that she has introduced. I can learn from her presentation that there has been a recent policies introduced in the...
Just speak on the mic, please.
My question is to Dr. Metka. I learned from her presentation that there has been recent policy measures in France, Germany, Switzerland and Netherlands, where she has taken up a study in order to attract talent and skills. It's too early to ask the fallout of those policies, but what has been the response in order to assess the migration from third world countries to these destinations?
Yeah, we can see, even though these policies were introduced very recently, a decade ago, we could see an immediate response to those policies, that there was an increase in skilled mobility to those countries, which is not only because of the policies. There were other factors at play as well, that these economies were growing and there was more demand for skilled labor. But we can already see that there, what I showed before for the Netherlands, you can see that in 2004, immediately when the knowledge migrant scheme was introduced, you can see an immediate increase in migration of, that was only for Indians, but if you look at also other non-EU, we call it like third country nationals, you can see an increase of skilled migrants. So it was, from the perspective of host countries, it had positive impact.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Salahuddin, would you like to sum up in 5 minutes? Sorry. Yes. You can come this now.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patient hearing. 4 nice papers, excellent papers have been presented, but I am very scared that I have been given only 5 minutes. I think if I breathe, it will take 5 minutes. Anyway, the first paper, the promotion of international best practice in the field of diaspora strategy, a critical reflection on the expectation of policy transfer to date. Well, it was presented by Mark Boyle from Ireland. He was the main objectives of this paper was to conceptualize the ways in which diaspora policies circulate between different countries, to identify and comment on the factors which determine success or failure of the specific policy transfers. And mainly he focused on the policy transfers, and also he was putting his finger at how remittance can be, remittance earnings can be used for philanthropies, activities, and peace process. And he also brought an example of, the money spent for the peace process in Ireland. In his paper, he focused on Ireland and Scotland. Next, actually I have to look at the time constraint anyway. Next paper was presented by Medka Horkak and Gabriela Tizada from Switzerland. The link with the home country, a comparative analysis of host country environment for diaspora engagement. Well, I think they took a survey, conducted a survey of 428 Indian professionals and respondents living in the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland and France. And they focused on both host country environment and facilities favorable migration policies, how favorable migration policies have influenced the Indian professionals and students to stay there. And also their final findings suggest that there has been strong transnational link among the Indian professionals and students living in these 4 countries, low level of interest for institutionalized contract with other overseas countries, Indians, low information about Indian government diaspora schemes, and also this study found strong interest among the Indians living in these 4 countries to return to India. And there were conclusions that they strongly recommended on merger of competitiveness goals and development goals, and also convergence in structural settings between host countries and the home countries. The third paper was presented by Brice Maharaj from South Africa. He focused on the causes, consequences and cost and consequences of brain drain. Well, his findings were really alarming. I mean, Africa is going to be empty in terms of skilled workforce in the next 20 years, as we have been hearing. So his findings, in this era of international perfect capital mobility, in this era of rapid globalization, we cannot expect that Africans will not move out of the country, but the consequences are very dangerous, as Professor Maharaj has been anticipated in his paper. Anyway, this is going to be a disaster. I mean, if the brain drain cannot be converted into brain gain to some extent. And the next paper was contrasting, it was presented by Margaret Walton-Robert, contrasting regional migration and diaspora-led transformation in Kerala and Punjab. She gave some, economic, a comparative statistics, comparative picture between Kerala and Punjab in terms of economic indicators, migration, development. And she also, focused on the way in which migration and the role of NRI, non-resident Indians, articulates with neoliberal restructuring process, which is already underway in India. Also, she made, a comprehensive comparison between Kerala, as I said, Punjab, and also Goa.
And the finding is that there has been migration causes development, but also fractured development. She also focused on some negative consequences of out-migration from these two states. And also she came up with some conclusions that remittance has not just only economic value, it has rather also social value, and also what role migration policy can play to broaden opportunities beyond networks of closure, social shift, and she also suggests social shifts may occur in light of policy. And so she gave an example like education. So these are the papers that have been presented, and I congratulate all the presenters for their outstanding presentation. Thank you. I'm sorry that I've been given only 5 minutes, but I gave a lot of efforts to make it lengthy. Anyway, it didn't work.
Finally, I can't resist the temptation of having a last word, because obviously one has learned a lot, especially the kind of migration and diaspora from Scotland and Ireland to USA and to advanced countries, etc., and the international best practices kind of debate which Professor Boyle pointed out. I also learned a lot from the presentation about Indian migration to France, Germany, Netherlands and Switzerland, and especially the question of return migration, of citizenship, of non-involvement into institutional mechanisms, etc., which are very salient points for us to bear in mind from a policy point of view. Of course, Dr. Brij Maharaj and myself have been in correspondence and in talk for a long time, and I agree with him totally that one has to look at the discontents of diaspora as well as the positive things. A theme which finally, and there my agreement is almost complete with Dr. Margaret Walton-Robert, when she says that we have to look at migration and development in tandem. And there are circuits, you see, of migration and development. And one should look at who pays and how much for diaspora and development. I'm reminded of Xiang Biao's study of information technology people from Andhra Pradesh into Sydney and cities in Australia. And he shows how dowry, for example, has increased. The payment of dowry, which was unknown in certain village areas, has been increased in order for people to gain rudimentary information technology things in India, and then to pay and sit on the bench and so on forth and be secure, in Australia for a long time and so on. So I think these discontents of development and diaspora is the flip side of the picture which was presented in the morning, you see. And I think it is a good point that in the beginning, in this initial panel, we have looked at the bright side and the dark side of both the questions. And I'm sure that this is going to lead us to some fruitful discussion, conclusion, publication, etc. in the times, months to come. Thank you very much.
Those were indeed very enriching presentations. Thank you. On behalf of the conference organizers, I thank Professor Jain for conducting the session so well and almost within the time limit. I also thank Dr. Mohammed Salahuddin for his valuable remarks. For the participants, the parallel session shall begin at 2:15 after lunch in the main hall, and room number 5, which is on the second floor. The lunch will be served in the guest house, and we again request you all to please be back in time.